I love that quote of St. John Chrysostom, who said that, there are some bishops, I'll say people, because it applies for all of us. There are some of us who see their parish as the universe, and there are others who see the universe as their parish. And I think the latter is orthodoxy. Archbishop Anastasios once said there's no such thing as a non-missionary orthodoxy. Mission is in the very DNA of our faith. So I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and was doing music in the 90s. And as I traveled around to different churches, because I was doing Christian music, I quickly realized that every church I went to had a little different Jesus that they worshipped. And that the different Jesuses all had different versions of Christianity too. And so that reality, coupled with the fact that in my early days, I realized that the experience of worship in the churches that I was playing in was as affected by the tuning on the guitar or the lights and the sound as it was by anything else. I became pretty disillusioned with Christianity. I had a good friend. We lived together, an artist named Kevin Clay, who used to play in a band called My Little Dog China, and some people might have heard of them. But anyway, Kevin and I lived together, and we really started reading a lot about St. Francis and talking about things that 20-year-olds talk about, Renaissance, revival, and revolution, I think was the three things that we talked about pretty much all the time while smoking Lucky Strikes and drinking Jack Daniels and trying to play acoustic guitar. Wee morning hours. And so, but that kind of milieu ended up becoming a pretty creative space where we were exploring the early Desert Fathers. And I got to the early Desert Fathers through St. Francis. And so I started reading a lot about St. Francis, and then from St. Francis into the early church. Well, so one day I had been pretty disillusioned by the Protestant Christian experience that I had had in the Christian music industry in Nashville and traveling around. I was never really any good. I was sort of a has-been who never was, but I played a lot. And, as I got done with a year and a half of playing, probably more than I've ever played in my life, night after night, and opening for other groups and traveling, I just was done with church. I wasn't done with God, but I was done with church. I hadn't been raised in the church, so I had no real nostalgia other than, maybe Christmas Eve or something like that, going to church with my family. So I was done. It didn't feel authentic. What felt more authentic was, these conversations with my friends about the early church fathers. But I didn't know anyone who was doing that other than us, and there was no kind of formal exposure to the Orthodox Church. So one day, though, I'm on a double date with my wife-to-be, Jody, and some good friends. And we came out of a TJI Fridays in downtown Nashville. And as we came out, it was 11 o'clock. I remember it, 11 o'clock on a Friday night in Nashville, downtown. And I see this twinkling lampada light in a window across the parking lot. And this big, at the time I thought it was a poster of Jesus. And I thought, wonder what that's all about, this little shop. So I motioned to my fiance at the time. I said, let's go check that out. And she kind of rolled her eyes and was like, here we go. I was always sort of looking for those things. So I went in and I looked over there and I tried to yank on the door, but it was locked. So I went, I put my eyes and my hands to the window like this because there was a big street light. And I looked in there and I saw there was this guy in a black robe with a long beard, and he was doing dishes in the back with his robe rolled up like this, and he was working. And I saw in there these blue walls and these books everywhere, and I saw smoke or incense or something on the inside, and these lampadas, and I was like, I don't know what this is, but I got to check it out. So my my fiance said, Jody said, well, let's come back. They're closed. And I said, I don't care. I want to know right now what this is. So I knocked on the door, and a couple minutes later, out walks now Father Parthenius. Then he was Deacon Seraphim. Father Parthenius, came to the door in his kind of quiet, meek way, and he said, hello, may I help you? And I said, what is this? With all the kind of gusto of a 22-year-old or whatever I was. And I said, what is this place? What is this? You guys Christians or something? And he said, well, we're closed right now, but this is the Door to Paradise bookstore and a Lector Cafe. And I said, well, can I come in? He goes, well, I have some leftover coffee. I was about to pour it out. Let me give you some, and then you can come in while I finish the dishes. So at this point, I'm basically dragging Jody in with me. And I get in there, and I smell this incense and these books from floor to ceiling and the little cafe tables. And I see, kind of down the hall, maybe something like a little chapel. Couldn't really see it then, but all of a sudden, it was like the Holy Spirit came upon my heart in a way that I hadn't known in years since I first encountered Christ in very different circumstances. And I knew that I was home. As cliche and as Father Peter Gilchrist as that sounds, I was home. And, a blessed memory. And I didn't know what it was. My wife, at the same time, though, was having a completely opposite reaction. Like, what is this place, And so we left that night. I took a card or a brochure or something, and we started coming back regularly. I was still studying music business and audio engineering at Belmont University, and I lived very close by, so I walked down. So that's how I encountered Orthodoxy. And what was amazing is that elector is this old word that is a Greek word that refers back to the rooster that crowed 3 times when Peter's soul was awakened. So I really like to tell the story that it was, a Friday night at 11 o'clock, and at the 11th hour, the rooster crowed in my heart, and I was really awakened, and I met Christ in his fullness in that moment. Now, it was some 3 years before I would enter into the church. I was a catechumen for probably 1.5 to 2 years, and eventually was chrismated. But it was a powerful experience. And if it weren't for that missionary zeal of Father Parthenius and his wife, Mariska Marian, and the society that they were a part of, which that was a Valam Society bookstore, which there aren't many left anymore. Now it's all Amazon, But that zeal that they had really was what attracted me. It wasn't the books. It wasn't the place. I sensed something authentic in the people. And of course, we had our own struggles. As time went on, we're human beings. But ultimately, I saw in them a living faith, a connection to a worldview that I was hungry for, that I was reading in bits and pieces in Francis and, discovering through poetry and, songs and creativity. It was like, instead of being just able to grab little scraps in life, I actually found this deep well and was able to drink from it, and it was overwhelming. And from there, the journey began. I think that was 1997. And apparently we walked in maybe about a week after they had opened this bookstore. And, thanks be to God, Mariska, Jody, and I think, were the first converts in their little mission church there. And I really thank God for them and for their labors and for the labors of the brotherhood that they were a part of, without which I wouldn't maybe even be a Christian today, let alone Orthodox and a priest. So Reconciliation Services was founded by my spiritual father, Hiram Monk Alexi, and his wife of blessed memory, Mariska Michaela. And Reconciliation Services is really a crumb from the altar of the church that they founded, called St. Mary of Egypt in the Serbian Orthodox Diocese in the Midwest. And reconciliation services was also the inspiration for the work that others have done, including Focus North America and some other ministries that have started or attempted to start. There's something very special about what they did and what Reconciliation Services still does. It's no longer a parish ministry. It hasn't been for decades because of size, but it's also it's an important experiment in a way for how do we in this context and in this society bring forth the kind of things that St. John of Kronstadt was doing in his house of industry in Kronstadt, or St. Basil the Great was doing with the first hospitals of the Zenons, or Mother Maria of Paris was doing with the hospitality houses. For she did a lot more than just hospitality houses. She actually took government funding. She had a farm. They had certain industry that spun up after that. It takes its inspiration also from an Orthodox Christian missionary approach that can be seen really beautifully in modern day sort of elder fathers like Archbishop Anastasios, who labored in Albania, and then people that labored with him, like Father Luke Veronis. Today, there's a parish, St. Mary's, on the 3rd and 4th floor of an old brick building that used to be a bunch of different things in the past, including something called President's Shirt Shop, which was a place where Harry Truman worked selling shirts. But today, the 3rd and 4th floor is the parish, and we've really grown beyond the capacity of that. Thanks be to God. The first 2 floors are reconciliation services, and reconciliation services has as its mission to cultivate a community of people that care about tearing down the racial and economic segregation that still exists, no longer by law, but by choice now, and cultivating a community that cares about reconciliation so that we can transform Troost Avenue in Kansas City, which is the historic dividing line between black and white, and now not only black and white, but rich and poor, and transform that into a gathering place, a place where the kingdom is manifested in a real way. So the work that we do follows this innovative continuum of care that starts with healthy communities, which is all about relationship building. So the work that we're doing there is called Thelma's Kitchen, and I'll come back to describe that. The second thing would be social services, like helping people get IDs and birth certificates, medicines that they need, housing and utilities, the kind of functional, practical things to address and triage immediate poverty. After that, you get into the heart of the matter, which is mental health work and trauma. Our program is called the Reveal Program, and we call that a stealth mental health program because it is evidence-based in its orientation. It's run by master's level social workers and clinicians, but some of whom who are Orthodox, but it is also reaching a certain group of people who regularly don't get treatment or don't think they need it or don't have the access to it for PTSD, for trauma, for depression. And then the last step on the continuum is what we call economic community building, and we have a program called the Foster Grandparents Program, and then another work that we're starting called RS Social Ventures, which is actually a for-profit owned by the nonprofit. So this whole bunch of things that we have, these 4 big buckets from healthy communities, social services, trauma therapy, and economic community building, all takes its inspiration from the work of the church, from the exact kind of things that Mariška Michaela and Father Alexei were doing in the early days, although at a different size or scope, but with the exact same heart and DNA. At least that's our endeavor. So it's different than a normal social service agency, not just because it's got some Orthodox Christians who run it, or that it was founded by an Orthodox Christian priest, but because the theopraxis of Orthodoxy actually is embedded within the the very DNA of the organization as much as we can. And that means the way that we treat people as living icons of God, the way that we approach trauma, the way that we look at each other as staff and care for one another, as well as the way that we approach the community, especially because we're dealing with a reality in our city that is tied not only to economics, but to racial segregation and discrimination. The problem is that our community, like every community in the United States, has this demarcation in it that is an icon or a symbol today of the racist ideologies and the manifestation of that heresy that's a stone's throw away from my lifetime and within the lifetime of people like Father Moses Berry, and still continues to this day in structural ways and in other ways, both overtly and hidden. So our work has to be about more than just social work. And if it was just about social work, then I should just be a priest and we should give all the money to Catholic Charities or somebody because they do a great job, or Salvation Army or something. But there's got to be something unique. And a part of what is unique is the fact that we're bringing together Orthodox Christian theology as well as non-Orthodox Christians together into a mix to dialogue with one another and as staff, as board members, about our life experiences and our perspectives. We're drinking deeply, those of us who are Orthodox, from the icons left behind of this kind of work of mercy from the early church and the modern church. And then we're throwing into the mix of all of that a real attempt for cultural humility that is rooted in Orthodox repentance. And in that, a cultural sensitivity to the reality and connection between the poverty that we're addressing specifically on the east side of Troost and the way that came to be through discrimination and segregation. The folks that we serve, 74% or so of whom are African American and 99% of whom live 100% below the federal poverty level, living on nothing. They're mostly African American, and it's not that that just poof came to be. It happened through a deliberate and an intentional carving out of the economy and of progress of a very specific people group. They were relegated into a particular area of town, and they were not allowed to participate in things like home ownership. You look at the history of redlining in the real estate industry where loans were not given to certain areas. Well, where were all of those areas? The majority of them were the black neighborhoods. If you look at the history of African American veterans who for a long time did not get the GI Bill or have the same kind of access to VA loans that like my grandparents did. Well, how did my grandfather buy a house? When he came back from World War II, he was in the Navy and he was able to get a loan. He became an engineer. He went to school. He bought a house. And then as that house appreciated, wealth is built. So this community that we're serving on the east side of Troost has not only endured the suffering of racial prejudice, but also has a certain stinging economic reality that is tied to that prejudice that still continues today. And our work is not complicated. Our work is hard, but not complicated. It is really to just walk with our neighbors, not to do for, but to walk with them. Try to be Christ Emmanuel, God with us, and to manifest the love of God by, number one, acknowledging that 200-year history of Troost and the history of segregation and its effects, to acknowledge it, to give space for it to be reality, for the trauma of that to be acknowledged. And that happens through listening to people's family stories, listening to what happened when 71 Highway was like a knife ripped through the black community and whole neighborhoods were turned into paved um, highway so that we could go from the new white suburbs to the downtown. And listening to their family stories about what it was like to live in Kansas City and go to segregated schools like Lincoln Prep, which is a wonderful school, but was the historically, it was the only school that black folks were allowed to go to in high school in that area. So our founder knows the mayor, and he's been a great supporter, Mayor Sly James. He's an African-American man, a Marine, an attorney, incredibly talented man. But he recounted for me the story when he was a young man. I think he said he was 15 or 16. He went to an all-white high school. I think it was Bishop Hogan. But he lived in the African-American part of town, and he had in his home folks in his family who were Black Panthers. So he was going to an all-white Catholic school and coming home at night to Black Panthers, and then thrown into the mix of that, you've got the assassination of Dr. King. And in 1968, about 4 days after the assassination and a few days after riots started elsewhere, riots broke out in Kansas City. This mayor of ours recounts the story of coming back home. He said driving home with some friends from, I think it was the Lay's potato chip factory or something where he was working, a late shift. And as they were coming down Prospect to 31st Street or somewhere in that vicinity, these lights just came on everywhere, all around. And these cops, these police were standing there in the street with guns pointed at them. And they had to get out of the car and lay down on the ground with guns at them. You know, who are you? Why are you out past curfew? Don't you know what's going on? And he had been working. So as he was telling me this story, and he's my parents' age, you know, he's not much older than I am, I'm thinking about how the reality of that family story, how his experiences of growing up in the world that he lived in, with the parents he had and the school that he went to, how those things shaped who he is. And if we don't listen to the story, if we as white European Americans do not listen to the stories of our neighbors, we will never understand why they feel the way that they do. And if we presume to know how to help people or presume to know how to be brothers with one another without actually hearing them, we'll miss the mark every time. So acknowledging the suffering, acknowledging the trauma, acknowledging the history, listening to the family stories, this is sort of step number one at reconciliation services. Step two is to begin to work towards some sense of sharing our blessings with each other, sharing our strength, not just financial strength, but actually sharing our time, sharing our talents. And so we've developed ministries like Thelma's Kitchen, where people come and serve together as equals, not just sort of suburban volunteers and urban volunteers or rich and poor, but we come together and serve each other as equals and as neighbors and begin to lay a foundation for us to have encounters where we can share life together. You know, we live in these intentionally segregated communities, not segregated by law anymore, but segregated by choice, at least in Kansas City. I know it's different in some other places. I've lived in New York, but Kansas City is what you might call a hyper-segregated city. And the last piece of the puzzle for us, after sort of deep listening and then a radical attempt at sharing life and resources together, is to move from that into community building together, where we try to lift one another up, try to have efforts of development without displacement, try to walk together in a way so that you're building a ship where like everyone's ship rises together. You're not just building something for one group, but you're really trying to build a city together. There's one of my favorite authors is a famous city planner named Jane Jacobs. And Jane Jacobs said that cities are only, I'm going to paraphrase, but she said cities are only for everyone when they're built by everyone. And this whole idea of a city as liturgy, the kind of movement of the city, the needs of the people, the feeding of people, the raising of resources, the development of beauty, the cultivation of place and place making. looking at the assets in the community rather than the deficits. This is all, in the mix. Inspired by Orthodoxy, not germane only to the church, but certainly inspired by the church, and sort of at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish at Reconciliation Services. The last thing I would share about that, and I haven't shared much of the details, but I think it's critically important that we figure out ways in our context. This is not a theocracy. We don't have the czar who's going to establish orphanages, right? We have to live within the realities of 501c3s and tax exemptions and business models and all this kind of stuff. And we have to be the church. And we have missions that are struggling to pay their priests. And, these things can be brought together. And there's creativity that can emerge. There's this idea of social venturing where you would have a work that has a social aim, but that actually is self-supporting. And those social ventures can be of the church. They can be done together with the community. And I think that there's a lot left to explore. There's a lot left to mine in the genius and the inspiration of people like St. John of Kronstadt, who not only served the liturgy every day and had his cathedral and a robust ministry, but he also had this vision for this house of industry, which was a felt hat workshop. It was a dormitory. It was a school. They sold these felt hats all over Moscow and all over Russia as a way of supporting all of the other social work and addictions work and other things that they were doing. See, we don't have to be afraid of doing these things. We can apply all of the creative genius that God will give us, what we have, and baptize what's baptizable, and try to find creative ways to be the church in the world. I love that quote of St. John Chrysostom, who said that, there are some bishops, I'll say people, because it applies for all of us, there are some of us who see their parish as the universe, and there are others who see the universe as their parish. And I think the latter is orthodoxy. Archbishop Anastasios once said there's no such thing as a non-missionary orthodoxy. Mission is in the very DNA of our faith. So we have this context. Capitalism, a two-party system, business and fundraising, all these things. So we can either kind of run away from that and sort of say, well, I'm going to stay in the church and everything's going to kind of be parish-sized. Or we can look at people like St. John of Kronstadt and we can say, okay, there's some who want to do more than that and are capable of doing more than that. And we can do that as Orthodox Christians without being afraid. We're going to make mistakes, but, it's like our children. We have to be okay with making mistakes. Take a so-called lean startup entrepreneurial model. Try something. If it doesn't work, pivot. Try something else. That's important right now. If we do that together, we can find new ways to care for each other and ways of manifesting the same word of God that's been from the beginning, just using new words for this new context. And I think, in essence, that's what we inherited from Father Alexei and Matушka Michaela. I don't said it in my own way, but that's what inspired me so much. They lived that radical life as Orthodox Christians and poured all of their creativity into it. That's what gave birth to Reconciliation Ministries and then Reconciliation Services. And the proximity, physical and spiritual proximity of St. Mary of Egypt Orthodox Church and Reconciliation Services is important. And there is a sympathetic resonance as the two are brought close together that's greater than, in its sum than the individual parts.